Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is 1:30, so I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Joe Philippek. I am Consulting and Continuing Education Manager for Rails. I'm very happy to have all of you here with us today for this webinar, so Introduction to Copyright. Just a few quick notes before we get started today. A reminder that you have a chat box, which for most of you is on the left-hand side of your screen. And that will give you the opportunity to ask questions of our presenter today, or to respond to any questions if she asks any of you. Hopefully you received an email I sent out yesterday that included a couple links to videos that will be used during the presentation. Because Fuse can't broadcast video, we're just asking that you pull up the video at the point in the presentation in which that's indicated. If you didn't see that email, I'll post the URL for the videos in the chat box in just a little bit, and it will also be on a slide at the appropriate moment. I will also remind everyone that we are recording the webinar today, and it will be posted to the Rails CE archives page within a few days. So if it's something you want to refer back to or have a colleague you think would benefit who couldn't be with us today, just keep in mind that will be there. And finally, I do just want to remind you all of a few upcoming training opportunities that are happening this month through Rails. We have a webinar on library user experience that is being done by Aaron Schmidt, who did a few webinars for us in the summer on web design. That is going to be on September 18th, and it is filling up, but last time I looked, there are some spots available. And on September 15th and 17th, we are having a two-part introductory webinar on digitization, which is being done by a consultant from Lyrasis. And finally, on September 22nd, we are going to have a webinar on licensing of electronic content, which is also going to be done by today's presenter, who I am pleased to introduce to you all right now. Rails is very happy to have Becky Albitz with us today for this webinar. Becky is the Associate College Librarian for Collection Management at Bates College, which, Becky, and I'm going to unmute you now, I think that is in Maine, am I right? That Bates College is in Maine? Okay, cool. Yes, and Becky, I know was previously also the Electronic Resources and Copyright Librarian at Penn State. So with that, Becky, I'm just going to pass things over to you. You should see that first slide on the screen and then control it towards the bottom as you want to move the slides forward.
Right. Thanks, Joe, and thank you all for participating in this. My goal here today is to offer really an overview of copyright. There are a couple of things I want to start out by saying. I am not an attorney. I have a master's degree in film, which in many ways makes me qualified in copyright areas for those of you who have media backgrounds. We know that we live and breathe this stuff. And also I wanted to let you know that in many cases what we're going to say and discuss during this webinar, copyright really has to do with risk assessment. So it may show a response to a question may seem overly conservative to you, it might seem overly liberal to you, but it often depends on the context within which you're using the materials, how liberal or conservative you feel you need to be. And we'll address that a little bit as we go through the program. And please don't hesitate to ask questions during the group chat, and assuming that I'm looking in the right direction, because I'm talking in a phone and my computer's on my right and my notes are on my left. So if I happen to miss you, I will catch your questions as we go along. So with no further ado, I want to start by showing you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to do some basic definitions of copyright. We're going to talk about some changes that have occurred recently, and I use the word recently in quotes because most of these happened either in the late 90s or early 2000s, so there hasn't been a lot of copyright law change in the recent past, unfortunately or fortunately. And again, we can talk about that too. I do want to talk briefly about the doctrine of first sale. That's how libraries operate, and it's really central to what we do. I'm going to spend a good amount of time on fair use because this is probably the most nebulous concept in copyright law, and yet it's the one we rely on most when we're using other people's works. And then finally, I do want to talk about educational use of media. This is the actually the most common question I have received in relation to K-12 educators about when it's appropriate to use media, both in the classroom and in an electronic environment. So we will definitely talk about that in the end. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is what is copyright, and this seems like a fairly basic question, but it is Title 17 of the United States Code. If you want to go read it and you're having problems sleeping at night, there's the URL on the copyright website. And it's a right, these are rights granted by Congress in the Constitution to authors, artists, and inventors. The intention, and this is in the code, is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. Some people think it's to promote income, but it's not. It really was intended to encourage inventors to continue to invent by giving them essentially monopoly ownership over the content or the materials that they developed. And it's also intended to be in place for a limited time. And there are two important statements I want to highlight as we move forward from this slide. The first one is that these are rights granted by Congress, and that's going to be important in a later discussion we have. And it's also intended to be in place for a limited time. That's as specific as the language gets. So you'll see in just a few minutes why that has become a bit problematic for all of us. So what is copyrightable? This is just a long list of things that you can create or have authorship over. It has to be an original work, and it must be fixed in a tangible medium. And it says now known or that will be developed in the future, which means digital content is considered a tangible medium. They are bits and bytes. But it can't be a thought or a concept. It actually has to be memorialized in some kind of physical way. So they can be written works, fiction, nonfiction, lesson plans if you're a teacher. It could be this PowerPoint presentation. Lesson plans and PowerPoints we'll talk about just briefly because those may or may not be might not be your personal copyright. They might be considered a work for hire. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Could be musical works, dramatic works, pictures, films, sound recording, architectural works. It's important to remember that facts are not copyrightable. And again, we'll address that in just a minute. I want to go back to talking about lesson plans and PowerPoints for a moment. When I've given this presentation to graduate students who are in K-12 education, that's usually the first question that comes up. Do I own my lesson plan? And it really depends on if, in fact, you've signed a contract with your school district. And this is true for higher education, too, with faculty and their syllabi or any online content they might create for a hybrid course. If, in fact, your contract says that the work that you create is owned by your employer, then you give up this right to own the work you've created. If, in fact, that language doesn't exist, then there's a balance usually between the resources that you use to create that content, if they are your resources or if they are your employer's resources. Often people will do this kind of work and they'll do it at home, in which case it is your copyright. If you're using resources that your employer provides and you're doing it during work hours and the intent is to have you use them in your classroom, then that becomes more of a gray area. So it's a good idea to have an idea of how your employer views the works that you create as part of your job. I hope I haven't confused things, but again, this is a K-12 question that I get a lot. So moving forward, what are the requirements for copyright protection? Often people think that you still have to use the copyright symbol. That, in fact, is no longer the case. As long as something is original and it appears you've put it in a fixed medium of some kind, it is automatically copyrighted. So you don't have to put the C on it. A lot of people still do. And you don't have to register it with the United States Copyright Office, but there are reasons why you might want to do that. It's a public record of your claim to the material. So if you submit, for example, a screenplay outline, and you want to make sure that when you send that screenplay off to a studio, and those guys may or may not steal the idea from you, not to assume people are bad, but sometimes we hear about these things happening. If you had filed that with the Copyright Office, you would have had a logical claim to the ideas and to the content. You must have your work registered to file an infringement lawsuit. So you can't sue somebody unless your work is already been filed. And you must register it prior to an infringement in order to claim any kind of statutory damages and attorney's fees. Otherwise, you can recover only actual damages. And the reason why that's important is that in many copyright situations, copyright infringement cases, there really are no financial damages. And I'd like to give an example about that. So back when I was at Penn State, I gave this presentation or one similar to it frequently. And a colleague of mine at Penn State apparently liked it so much that he decided to take that the same slides. He added animation and changed the design a little bit, and then he gave that presentation at EDUCAUSE, and he claimed it as his own. I only found out about it purely by happenstance. Now, I had not, of course, filed my PowerPoint with the Copyright Office, so if I had done so prior to his taking it without my permission, I might have been able to sue him and get statutory damages and attorney's fees. But because I had not, the only thing I could claim were actual damages if I had pursued it. I had no financial damages, so the whole thing would have been moot. And it was just one of those, you sort of chalk it up to life's experiences. But this is particularly why, if you think that you've created something of value and of monetary value, that you do want to register it with the Copyright Office. And there's information on the Copyright Office website about how one can do that. All right. And I've forgiven this person. It's only been about maybe 10 years, but notice I still use it. It's very helpful when I'm talking about this. Okay, so the copyright law was originally written in 1976. And as you can imagine, by the time 1998 rolled around, so much had changed that it was very difficult to apply that language to current technologies. And by current, I'm saying almost, hard to believe this, 15 years ago. So back in 1998, Congress decided that they needed to update the copyright law, and what they wrote was something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. There are four specific. The DMCA is very difficult because it goes into the 76 copyright law and phrases and clauses. So if you don't know what the differences are and you look at the current copyright law, they just incorporate those changes. If you look at the DMCA, they are literally edits. So it's a difficult document to read, but I've given you a link at the bottom of this slide that gives you a little bit more information about the DMCA. the three important changes that occurred were, first of all, that this law prohibited the circumvention of technological protection measures or any kind of digital rights management software that's been superimposed upon content. So as we know, CDs and DVDs have digital rights management software on them. It prevents you from making copies of them. And this section of the law prohibits you and makes it a crime to circumvent those protection measures, either by reverse engineering it or by finding some other way to break the lock on it. And just a side note to this, this one section or one prohibition caused a lot of problems, because if you can't break the lock on a DVD, for example, how are you supposed to be able to take clips of it and use it in what most people would define as a fair use manner? So what happened is the Register of Copyrights decided that I believe it's every 3 years, and I think that's the case, that she would hear requests for any kind of exemption to this rule. The original exemptions were granted to faculty members in higher education institutions who were teaching media studies classes. So they were allowed to break the lock on DVDs, rip clips, and then create compilation clips in order to basically teach film classes. The second wave of exemptions broaden these to anybody using media materials in an educational setting, a nonprofit educational setting. The latest ruling, which occurred in 2010, expanded the exemptions for breaking digital rights management locks on things much, much wider. It's beyond media now. It's to things like remote controls, and it has just really expanded the ability to use things that are digitally locked down. I didn't reproduce the list because it is quite expansive, but if you go to the copyright website, you'll be able to see what the exemptions are. The second element that was I'm sorry, I'm having one of those days. Okay, the second element was, and this is pretty obvious, it prohibits the alteration of information embedded in digital works, like ownership watermarks. So you're not allowed to Photoshop out somebody's watermark on an image and then claim it as your own. And or even if you don't claim it as your own, you're not allowed to remove that identifying mark. And finally, the third element, and this is very important to a lot of colleges, universities, and school districts, is it limits Internet service providers' liability if somebody on their network infringes another person's copyright. So as long as the institution agrees to follow some very general rules, including having a contact person to whom any kind of infringement claims can be sent, as long as that person is publicly registered, then if a student, for example, on the Bates campus decided to post illegal films on our network, then Bates College, as long as they follow certain protocols, is not liable, even though we own the network. An interesting experience happened at Penn State when I wasn't there at the time, but I remember reading about this in the Chronicle. And Penn State's Department of Astronomy received a cease and desist notice from ASCAP, from the music industry, saying that someone on their astronomy website had posted MP3 versions of songs produced by Usher. And so they received a cease and desist notice and were told to take down that website, that server. And the problem was this was during finals week, and so they had a lot of exam study materials up there. They had homework answers. They couldn't really take down the website without putting their students at a great disadvantage. So the server, the guy who was in charge of the server in that department, decided he was going to go figure out what was going on. So he went searching on his in his files that he was responsible for, and he discovered indeed that there were MP3s on there. They were of a singing group that was made up of astronomers at Penn State. They have an a cappella group, which is actually quite good, and they were singing Christmas songs. So they had those on the server. And he discovered, or he probably knew this, that there was a professor emeritus of astronomy at Penn State named Peter Usher. So what had happened was the person from the music industry had done a keyword search on Google and pulled up this site. You did the search Usher and MP3, got a hit, and without even looking at what the content was, sent Penn State a cease and desist. So this just goes to show that sometimes when you do get a cease and desist, it makes sense to do a little bit of internal exploration before automatically shutting down your servers in response to someone complaining that your people have violated copyright. However, Penn State, in that circumstance, would not have been liable even if somebody somehow had posted actual MP3s of Usher's music on their website. All right, so that's what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act did back in 1998. That made some people more comfortable, the industry certainly, the music and entertainment industry, with their ability to protect their content, certainly by locking down. This is before we got to people ripping and making things or streaming things being available. They were still concerned about the physical manifestation of their CDs and DVDs. Another change happened, and this change passed with the DMCA, but it actually was a separate act, and it was called the Bono Copyright Extension Act. And I just want to ask y'all, just to make sure you're awake, to have somebody type in, they remember who Bono is? Anybody want to chime in and say they know who this person is? You got it, Chuck. Sonny and Cher. So it is Sonny Bono. He wasn't the governor of California. He was a congressman from California, and his district consisted of Hollywood. I mean, that's where he lived, and so that was the district he represented. He proposed that at this point, copyright would stay in effect for the life of the holder plus 50 years after their death. And he decided that he wanted to extend that from 50 years to 70 years. And so this was back in the late 90s. Does anybody out there know why Sonny Bono's constituency consisted of the entertainment industry in many ways, wanted copyright extended? There's a very large studio in his district, and there's a large amusement park in his district. Yes, Josh, you got it, Disney. And Melissa's got it. This is affectionately known as the Mickey Mouse Copyright Extension Act. Mickey was about to roll into the public domain. And at that point, pretty much anybody could do with Mickey what they wanted to. And you can imagine that Disney was not terribly happy about that. So, and Scott says he's only ever heard of it as the Mickey Mouse Copyright Extension Act, which doesn't bode well for Sonny Bono's legacy, but that's okay. So obviously the Disney lobbied Sonny Bono to extend copyright so that they had control over Mickey for another 20 years. And as we know, this has taken place, and this is where that whole issue about limited time comes into play. How long is a limited time, as it's phrased in the Copyright Act? We will find out in just a second, but I do want to note that there's a link to a website called When Works Pass into the Public Domain. This is managed by folks at Cornell, and it's really, really extensive. It's a broader extension of one created by Laura Gassaway, who was, I want to say she was at Chapel Hill. I'm probably going to be wrong, but and she may have retired, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so she created the initial one, and this is an incredibly detailed checklist that allows you to go through and try and determine if a work is in the public domain or not. Checklist itself won't necessarily tell you. You'd have to do more digging to find out if something was registered with the Copyright Office, but this gives you some guidance in case someone says, oh, something was published in 1921, is it in the public domain? The answer to that would be yes, indeed. Okay, so Bono Copyright Extension Act passed. Oops, I went on just a little too quickly. There was a challenge to this act, and the challenge was taken to the Supreme Court. The case was called Eldred versus Ashcroft, Ashcroft being the Attorney General at the time. And Eldred is an internet publisher, so he would take works that were in the public domain and he would reproduce them, make them available, so he didn't have to pay rights. He was basically republishing other people's works. By extending the copyright for an additional 20 years, he lost the ability to publish a whole bunch of stuff that had already rolled into the public domain. So his case made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said there's nothing we can do about this. We can't rule because we don't have standing. And the reason they didn't have standing in this case is that copyright is a right granted by Congress. Remember back to the second slide I showed you. These are rights granted by Congress. So in our divided power government that we have, the judiciary is not able to step into Congress's bailiwick and take over changing laws that Congress has passed, because Congress holds the right to manage copyright. I hope that makes sense. So basically, we're still operating under the Bono law that we have. And so everything, it remains in copyright until 70 years after the death of the copyright holder, which means anything that you have copyright on, for example, your grandchildren may be able to, you may be able to pass the copyright on to them, but it's still going to be held within your, or I should say within your life and within your children's life. Your material will still remain copyrighted. Okay, so you as a copyright holder, and we all own copyright because we all create content in one way or the other. What are you allowed to do with your own work? Well, you have the exclusive right to reproduce, distribute, perform, display, or transmit digitally your work, as well as the right to prepare works based on the original. So that's the right to create derivative works from your original work. And this gets tricky because a lot of people like to create derivative works based upon original work, and some people do it without getting permission. Some of you may remember that there was something called the Harry Potter lexicon. It was created online, and it was created by a librarian, and this person had created the most thorough lexicon of all 7 Harry Potter books that existed out there. It was the first timeline of that flowed through all seven books. You were able to track references to certain characters or charms or familiars, all of those things. They were all tracked in this incredibly thorough lexicon. J.K. Rowling, in fact, admitted that she used it herself to ensure continuity from one book to the next. So obviously this had great value. Then J.K. Rowling had a light bulb moment, as we like to say, and said, this person has essentially created a derivative work based upon my characters, based upon my copyrighted content. And so she decided then to file suit against this person, and the site basically had to be taken down because the person who had created it did not have the right to create a derivative work based upon her works. And her argument was that this site was in direct competition with the encyclopedia she was going to write. and which she has yet to write. In fact, has publicly stated that she has no plans at this point to write one. So this is an example where a copyright holder decides to actually pursue those who create derivative works based on their own work. You don't lose the copyright to your characters if, however, you choose not to pursue those who create derivative works. Any of you who are familiar with fanzines or fan fiction are well aware that there are people out there who create a lot of material based upon copyrighted characters, and in many cases, those people who hold the copyright are more than happy to allow this sort of gray literature to exist because it continues and creates more interest in their characters. Star Trek is a primary example where this occurs, and the Star Trek estate, Roddenberry's estate has basically allowed this to occur as long as I think that they may have some parameters within which they'd like people to operate, but they believe that this has kept Star Trek as appealing now as it was when it first came out. Okay, so that's if you're the copyright holder. Now, if you're not the copyright holder, what can you do with somebody else's work? So we're going to talk about 3 different ways that we use other people's copyrighted work without getting permission, I might add, which is always an option. The first, we're going to talk about the doctrine of first sale, as I mentioned. Then we're going to talk about fair use. And finally, then we'll talk about audiovisual materials. I'm going to find my... I think my slide here is going a little wonky, so if I can find the... Not letting me change the page, Joe. There, thank you. I don't know why. That was just decided to be a little strange. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about now is the doctrine of first sale. This is Section 110 of the Copyright Law, and all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. It permits you, as the physical holder, you don't own the copyright, but you are the physical holder of an object or a manifestation of copyright, or you are the owner of that physical manifestation of a copyrighted work. It allows you to sell, lend, rent, or dispose of that physical piece without any kind of permission. This is how we are allowed to have yard sales and have books in yard sales and videos in yard sales and records in yard sales. This is why you're not supposed to sell computer programs at yard sales. That's a different issue, and I'll talk about that in a second. Never do you actually obtain the copyright to that material. When you buy a book, and you all know this, when you buy a book or you buy a video, you don't actually get the copyright to that material. You just buy a piece of plastic or a bunch of pages with print on them. And so you can burn it, you can sell it, you can rent it, and again, this is how libraries and video stores operate. But you never, ever actually have the copyright to it. Computer programs tend to be different because they tend to be sold to individuals. Often they have keys, electronic keys that you have to use in order to unlock the content and load it on a computer. And often now, as we know, they come with shrink-wrap licenses, and those licenses supersede any ability for us to be able to claim the doctrine of fair use in like renting software to people in libraries. And this has become more of an issue, as you all know, because libraries are buying content less and less, and we're licensing content more and more. So when we license materials, even physical materials we are licensing, in some cases, if in fact the license says that you are not allowed to use something in a certain way, then you give up that right, and in many times they will say that you are, they hold or retain all of the rights under copyright except for those rights that they explicitly grant you. And we'll talk about this during the licensing workshop in a couple weeks. But if you give up your rights in a license to do something, including your ability to lend materials, then it's gone, unfortunately. So we as librarians have to be very careful, not only about the licenses that we do sign, particularly if they are for physical pieces, but we also need to try and retain the right to lend materials, even if it's digitally. So there are lots of conversations now about interlibrary lending of electronic books, and that's part of the rights that libraries are explicitly granted. It's not necessarily part of the doctrine of first sale, but we just want to make sure that we retain the rights to do what we already have earned the right to do through the copyright law. So that is the doctrine of first sale. And now we're going to spend a fair amount of time on fair use. So fair use is this nebulous idea that we are able to use portions of other people's works in certain ways, and we're able to do it legally. I think the biggest area that we tend to think about in fair use is when we quote somebody. So we're taking a portion of another person's work and we're reproducing it in our own work, but we're giving attribution to that material. And that's one fair use way, that is one way that we use fair use, is through quoting. So the actual language is, it's a use of a copyrighted work, including reproductions for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. This is not an infringement of copyright. So we are talking about reproduction. We're talking about copying other people's works. We are not talking about performing other people's works, and we're not talking about displaying other people's works. Those discussions occur in a different section of the copyright law. We're just talking at this point about copying other people's works. And the law says that there are 4 factors that are used to determine whether a use would fall under fair use protection or not. And those 4 uses are, the 4 factors, I should say, not 4 uses. And I'm going to read through these, and we're going to discuss them as we go through them. So the first is the purpose and character of use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. I know someone earlier on who had been in touch with Joe works, for example, for a for-profit K-12 institution, or not a college or university, but a school. Unfortunately, fair use is not a factor necessarily. They're not allowed to, they can probably use something on their fair use, but their analysis is going to be different than somebody who's working at a nonprofit institution. So it doesn't automatically mean that if your use is for a commercial purpose, that you automatically cannot claim fair use. But the other 3 factors better weigh really heavily in your favor in order for you to be able to make a solid argument that your use is a fair use. In many ways, when we talk about fair use, educators stop there. They just say, okay, I work in a nonprofit educational institution. My use is for educational purposes, so it's okay. I claim fair use. And they forget that there are 3 other factors, and you really do have to consider all 3 factors when we're doing this analysis. The second factor is the nature of the copyrighted work. So first, it's how it's being used. The second one is what is being used. Is something published or unpublished? For those of you, just to make sure you're still there, which do you think has greater fair use protection? Or I should say, you're able to claim fair use more readily if something is published or unpublished. All right, you guys are awake and exactly right. Yes, if someone has published something, they fully intend to share it with other people. Therefore, you have if I'm going to use something that's published, I have much more protection if I claim fair use than something is unpublished. So, for example, if someone grabs my diary, I do not have one, so someone cannot grab it. But if I were to have a diary and someone were to publish it, that would be a very difficult use to defend under fair use. Excuse me. Okay, the second element of number 2 is whether or not something is fiction or nonfiction. So which of those do you think, if you were to use it, you would have a stronger fair use claim? If something were fiction or nonfiction? We have mixed results with this one. Now we're seeing a little bit more of a weight toward nonfiction. Remember, facts are not copyrightable. If you think about information as a spectrum, and facts are on one side, and the most creative thing you can possibly think of, like interpretive dance, we're on the right-hand side. On the other side, nonfiction tends to be much closer to the factual side of that spectrum. The more creative you become with whatever you're working on, the more copyright protection you have, and the less I could claim a fair use if I were to reproduce it. So nonfiction is correct, and that does play a role in how the courts look at cases, if something is a creative work or a more factual nonfiction piece of work. So the third item is the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So it's not just the amount, but it's how important that segment of the work is to the value of the entire work. Okay, so it can be a very small portion, but it could be so critical to the value of the whole that reproducing that in some way or another really does damage the value of the content to the copyright holder. It's called the heart of the work. So you've got to be careful. You can't just use a word count as a determination of whether or not something is considered a fair use as one of the elements. You have to consider how important it is, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And finally, whereas educators tend to think that the first factor is the most important, those who own commercially valuable content believe the fourth is the most important. And this is the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. So people think that just because they have a copyright to a feature film or a song, and that there is a potential market for that, that means nobody should be allowed to copy it ever, ever, ever. But in fact, again, there are 3 other factors that have to be taken into account when one is doing a fair use analysis. So as I've been talking, I've been talking about using fair use in your analysis, and fair use is in fact a defense. As you're going through and using copyrighted material, it's useful to go through a process and do this analysis. And I'll show you the famous copyright or fair use checklist. I've got a link to it a little bit later on. But you want to be prepared if somebody were to approach you and say, your use is a violation of copyright. You have to be prepared to defend the way you've used copyrighted material. Sometimes the defense, it seems like a no-brainer. Sometimes not. It's a little bit more difficult to make the defense. Rarely is somebody sued and has to pay damages if they can present a logical, fair use analysis of the use that they've made of the work. So you're always, again, this is risk management. You're always trying to think about how somebody else might view your use, and that you need to be able to defend why you used the material in the way you did. All right, so fair use is a defense, and that means that these, when fair use is decided, it's done through court cases. So every way we have been able to define or establish parameters for the definition of fair use. They've been done through court rulings. And I'm just going to talk about three of what are probably the most famous of fair use cases. And in each of these cases, some level of boundary was established to help us operate and use and apply fair use. At least, well, not always in education. A lot of this was outside of education. The first case, however, is everyone's favorite, the Kinko's case. This was a case that where there were some universities and colleges in New York City who had been using Kinko's to create course packs. And when the faculty took, and these were faculty members who did it, or probably poor grad students, for those of us who remember those days, were sent off to Kinko's with copies of journal articles, book chapters, multiple book chapters from the same book. And just, they took them to Kinko's. Kinko's made copies of them. They put them together, and then they sold them for a profit, plus recouping their own copy costs. Basic Books was one of the publishers whose content ended up in one of those course packs, and they sued Kinko's. Kinko's claimed that their use was educational in nature, that they had not reproduced entire works. They were thinking books at the time. So they were basically, though, sort of hinging their argument on the educational use of the works that they had produced. Basic Books, on the other hand, said you're reproducing entire journal articles, you're reproducing entire book chapters. These are books that students would have bought as either textbooks or supplementary readings, which means that they could show damages. And the courts ruled that, in fact, as we know, that Kinko's was violating copyright law. So now whenever we create course packs, for those who still do create course packs, they're defunct here at Bates now, hooray. Because the last one we had to pay a huge amount of copyright clearance costs for. But you have to pay for those copyright costs on top of the reproduction costs ahead of time, and then we end up passing that cost on to our students. So this has to do with print course packs, of course, and some people are starting to see analogies with electronic reserves. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The ruling has not quite gotten to that case yet, but then again, that case is still under appeal, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen. Anyway, the second court case that's listed here is Sony versus Universal Studios. And again, just to ask you, does anyone out there remember what a Betamax is? Sarah, I love you. Sarah says, of course. And Chuck says, circa 1983. Sarah, some people don't know what they are, which is just amazing. But yes, Betamax was the direct competitor to VHS. It was created by Sony. It was smaller and a little more square. But it basically did the same thing that our VHS tapes did. VHS just happened to win the format war. Universal Studios saw this Betamax thing and said, by definition, if someone were to tape something off of television using Betamax tapes, they're violating our copyright because they are copying entire works of our copyrighted materials. Sony, on the other hand, said, we're just creating a piece of equipment, and we can't dictate how people use it. By definition, they would say that a piece of equipment cannot violate copyright law. So this did end up going to the Supreme Court. And the argument that Universal Studios made was a copying argument, but they also had a real concern about the effects of us copying television shows. Someone want to chime in and tell us all why Universal Studios was really worried about us making copies of television shows on our own VHS tapes. Most of us weren't going to sell them on a street corner. Not ratings, because people were still, I mean, they would still have been watching. Alicia's got it. Alicia says to skip the ads. I'll tell you honestly, my husband and I DVR everything we watch, and that's exactly what we do, is we fast forward through the ads. So it turns out Universal Studios had a real concern, a legitimate concern, because the amount that they could charge advertisers for time during programming, they were afraid was going to drop dramatically. And I don't know, Sarah, if that was just to me, but a lot of people do like the ads better sometimes than the shows that are on. So it depends on what you're watching. But so you can imagine that really was their concern. Now the courts ruled that because we were doing it in our own homes, the real purpose of what we were doing was something called time shifting. I tape material because I go to bed early, so I don't stay up until 11 o'clock, and which means that means I can't watch anything that starts at 10 o'clock at night. And I'm on the East Coast. I know you guys have that extra hour, and you're so lucky that you can actually watch 10 o'clock shows at 9 o'clock. But so I have to tape them, or there's no other way I can watch them. The courts ruled that is a personal use, that is not an infringement of copyright, and thus we have been allowed to have VHS tapes moving forward. Now the industry, the entertainment industry, became even more bent out of shape about TiVo, really the precursor of DVRing. It was one of the original DVRs, and their concern wasn't just fast forwarding through commercials at this point, because we were all doing it. Their concern was that those people who were making copies were making pristine digital copies of their programs. When we all made VHS copies of programs and then we taped over them, obviously the quality was so degraded in some cases that there was no commercial damage to the entertainment industry, but now they're even more concerned about that. So I don't know if DVRing and digital copying has really quite gone away as an issue. I think we may see it rear its head in the future, although it's been quiet for the last few years. The final case I want to talk about is Harper Row versus Nation Enterprises. And this case has to do with how much copying of something is really too much. Harper & Row, publisher, as we all know, they're the publisher of Gerald Ford's autobiography called A Time to Heal. It was published in 1979. It was a 500-page book. And Harper & Row had sold the serial rights, or basically the right to publish excerpts from the book prior to the book's release. They had sold those rights to Time magazine for, I think it was either $25,000 or $50,000. I can't remember. I think it was $25,000. Someone at Harper & Row left a manuscript just lying around somewhere, and someone from the Nation magazine somehow got a copy of this manuscript before it was published. The Nation magazine claimed that because Gerald Ford was a public figure, that they had the right to reproduce a very small portion of this 500-page book, maybe 300 words perhaps, that they had the right to publish those first, that they had a public service right to do that. That's a very, very tiny portion of a very long book. Obviously, Harper & Row sued, and Harper & Row won, even though it was a tiny, tiny portion of Gerald Ford's autobiography. What portion did the Nation publish? What would Gerald Ford have to say that people would be so excited about? And he could say it in a very, very short amount of space. was one of the first things Gerald Ford did. Ah, Scott, you got it. Yay. Mindy, hooray. Yeah, in 300 words, he talked about why he pardoned Richard Nixon. And everyone was wondering what the heck he was thinking about when he pardoned Richard Nixon. For many people, that was the heart of this work. A very small portion, but people would have bought that autobiography to figure out what he was, or to find out what he was thinking. Harper and Row sued, and Harper and Row didn't just win; they won damages because Time Magazine broke their contract for pre-publication rights, and so they had to pay back the $25,000 that they had originally received, and so they were able to show actual monetary damages in this case. Okay, so these are some of the critical cases that have been used to determine fair use law, and you can see how each one has a small piece in how we learn to define fair use. Again, though, if another fair use case were to come up, these parameters could shift one way or the other depending on the judge who hears the case. We're having more screen problems again, Joe. Sorry about this. Could advance for me? Thank you, sir. Okay, these are the two websites that I'd like you to watch. I don't know if any of you have watched these before. I promise in some cases the first one will offend some people. The second one probably not. But I'd like to take about, you may not even have to watch all of them, but I love them both so much I tend to watch them. Let's take about 5 minutes, if we could, and either watch them or watch them again, and then I'd like to talk about them. If you could sort of give me a thumbs up when you're done, I would appreciate that. Okay, I think we've got almost everybody back. Stop me if you want to finish up. Scott says he remembers the first one from years ago. I do too. I think it's hysterical, but it's very useful as a way to talk about this topic. So I've asked a question on this slide, which is, what is parody? And I've asked you to watch 2 videos, and I want to ask you, which one do you think is parody? I think we have about a 50-50 split here. Really interesting. For those of you who have chimed in, first of all, on Weird Al, I love that, by the way. I can watch that over and over again. Why do you think that's parody? Besides the fact that the title of the YouTube video says parody. Okay, and for those of you who think it was Take Off on the Song of Happy, absolutely. For those of you who think Jib Jab, the Bush Kerry one, is parody, tell me why, if you would. Tell us all why. Making fun of real people. And he says taking license with real people. I'm going to ask you to think about the Jib Jab one in a slightly different way. What is the original song that it's based on? Exactly, Mindy. And Mindy, there's a specific word there that is critical to this discussion. The original song was called "This Land Is Your Land." This land is my land. This one starts out, "This land is my land. This land is your land." There's a slightly different take on how that video describes politics these days, which is in a very divisive way. If you remember, Kerry is saying, "This is my land," and he shows you've got the mansion, and then "This is your land" of George Bush, and he shows the trailer. It's a real comment on how divided the country was between rich and poor, Republican, Democrat, Even at the end, there's a discussion about the division between Native Americans and those of us who have, built up on this land without thinking about its origins. Think about the original Woody Guthrie song. The original Woody Guthrie song was about bringing people together. It was about saying, this is your land, this is my land, we're all in this together. So it's a real comment using the song, This Land Is Your Land, the original. It's making a comment on the statement that Woody Guthrie was making, saying, no, we're not all united in this. Look at how divided we are right now. So it was making a comment on the original work. And in order to make that comment on the original work, it had to actually use a good portion of the original work so that as you're watching it, you say, oh, okay, I get the original, what the original was about, and now I see what the comment I understand the comment that is being made on it. That is parody, when you're actually commenting on the original work. Weird Al, on the other hand, this is what he does all the time. He takes a song that's very popular and he puts funny words to it. And that is not parody. That's creating funny songs with funny words. How does Weird Al get away with this? Anybody want to chime in? He gets permission. Absolutely, Melissa. He always gets permission. In fact, there was a feature on him, and I would say, Sarah, you're absolutely right. It is burlesque, but it's not parody. A parody is protected under the law. It is comment and criticism. That's where parody falls. Burlesque, now you're just making fun of something. In very entertaining ways. I am not saying that Weird Al isn't great. I think he's hysterical, but it is a different way. There's an article on him in the New Yorker this week that talks about when he asks people for permission, they are flattered that he does because they know that they're going to get a lot more traffic on their content than they aren't. Sarah asks, does parody have to be funny? Absolutely not, and I'm about to give you an example. I can't show this to you because unfortunately the website that did such an excellent job of describing this court case was taken down because it violated copyright law, shockingly, I'm sure. But a lot of you have probably heard of a court case called, and now I have to find my notes, here it is. It's called Campbell versus Acuff Rose, and this was back in 1994. There was a group called Two Live Crew, one of the early rap groups. They asked Roy Orbison's recording company, which was Acuff Rose Studios, if they could use a portion of Roy Orbison's song called Oh Pretty Woman. That was the name of that song, one we all know and love. Acuff Rose said, absolutely not, you may not use it, or portions thereof. So Two Live Crew's lead singer, his name is Luther Campbell, said, heck with it, I'm going to use one anyway. But he used it anyway. And what they did is created a song called Pretty Woman, so it automatically invokes the Roy Orbison song. It starts out with the same guitar riff that Roy Orbison uses in Pretty Woman. And then it goes off with lyrics that I couldn't really say to you, even if I had them in front of me, because they're pretty raunchy. And you can go out and search those words. So it's not by any stretch of the imagination funny. It is commenting, however, on people's image of Roy Orbison's song and, really Pretty Woman walking down the street, whereas the Two Live Crew song is really misogynistic. They won. So Two Live Crew won that court case. Their song was considered parody, and it has become one of the landmark court cases in discussing what parody is. And I hope that makes sense, because a lot of people, parody is a complicated, and I haven't done it justice. It is a complicated concept. But it's important to just remember, if you remember nothing else from this, is that parody is a comment or a criticism on an original work. That's why it falls under fair use. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I just want to, we're going to move quickly through audiovisual works, but this is the copyright fair use checklist, or the fair use checklist. I strongly urge you to take a look at it. It's very helpful in thinking things through. It's not a protection against being sued by any stretch of the imagination, but it does ask you to go through the 4 factors and really think about how you're using material. I've referred this to numbers of students, and they found it very helpful when they've been thinking about using materials in papers and such. So I hope you find it very useful. All right, fair use and plagiarism. Joe, I'm going to ask you to just move forward through this slide because this is one I'm really not going to talk about. We all know that, as I mentioned earlier, when you quote something, that is fair use, and it's just important that students understand that there are limits to how much one can use and have it be considered fair use. But I'm preaching to the choir on that, so I'm not going to go through it. What I do want to talk about is Section 110 of the law, and this is where the performance play of video come in. So we've talked about copying, and that's fair use. Now we're going to talk about performing or displaying. This is the section that allows you, if you are in a classroom, to play a video or a DVD during the class and not have it be a violation of copyright and not have to go get public performance rights and pay extraordinarily large amounts of money to do so. So the key parts of this is that you can show a motion media work in a classroom if it is done by or at the instruction of an instructor or a pupil, so it can be part of a student's presentation. It has to be in a face-to-face teaching environment, so you have to physically be there with your instructor and they have to be talking to you face-to-face. This does not cover distance education. It can only be used by nonprofit educational institutions. There's actually an exemption for government too, but I'm not going to go into that. So again, these for-profit schools cannot use Section 110 as a way to show films. It has to be done in a classroom or similar place devoted to instruction. So it can be done in a library. A library is considered a place of instruction, but it needs to be done in an enclosed area of the library. You can't just put up a screen and show something and not have it be a public performance. It can be done, say, we have screening rooms in our library, and so having students go in there and use and watch videos in there is perfectly legal. And finally, this says that it must be a legal copy. This is where we tend to fall into some issues because oftentimes our instructors have their personal copy that their brother got from their cousin who had a friend who made a copy. You know what I'm saying. They have to be. It really has to be a legal copy. It's not allowed to be someone's bootleg copy. But a legal copy does mean that you can use one that you get from Netflix. You can use, as long as it's the physical version of the copy, streaming Netflix material in classrooms have different issues involved, and those are licensing issues, not copyright issues, because you agree to a license when you agree to the streaming service. The thing about K-12, and this is where we run in, this is probably the biggest question I have, and when I tell people this, they get really upset. But the video has to be part of the curriculum. So you have to be teaching either the film itself, say in film studies, or if you're showing it, say, in a K-12 class, you need to be teaching the content. You are not allowed to show a video, for example, on a Friday afternoon because everyone behaved themselves, or right before a holiday break because, or, you know, whatever. It has to be part of the curriculum. And Chuck, I see your question, and we may have to do this offline, but I'll see if I can get to it in a sec. Sorry. In some cases, playing something like that, well, anyway, we'll talk about it in a second. Sorry. See, I got all engaged now. But yeah, so if you show, for example, if you were to show Free Willy in a K-12 classroom, you better be doing a unit on whales. You gotta at least try to link it. This is the other issue that we run into are things like daycare centers that show Disney films. Those are for-profit businesses, daycare centers. So putting the kids in front of Pocahontas is actually a violation of copyright. And I'm sure some of you have heard that on occasion Disney decides to go after daycare centers for doing things like that, just to flex their muscles. So this is the working with physical media in a classroom setting. If in fact you're going to show a video in your library and it's just because someone wants to have a film festival, or in college, if the French club wants to have wants to show a film because it's French and they want to see a French film, that is a public performance, and that needs to have you pay for public performance rights. A lot of schools have licenses with Swank or another distribution company that allows you to pay up front for public performance rights. You don't need to charge admission, but if you're not doing it within the parameters of this section, then it is actually a violation of copyright. That got a little convoluted. I apologize. It's getting a little late in the day. But I hope that makes sense to people. Where we run into questions is when you start talking about digitizing film and you start talking about using film in an online environment. This is where people start to hear, sorry about that, you'll start to hear phrases or the phrase, the Teach Act. And so I want to talk about the Teach Act on the, got it, all right, it works. Excuse me. So the Teach Act was passed in 2002, and it was an attempt to address the concerns surrounding distance education. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act didn't even attempt to approach. It basically makes changes to Section 110, which was the section right before. You saw Section 110.1. The Teach Act is Section 110.2. It explicitly permits you to copy clips of feature films for use in online courses offered through a course management system. So it has to be protected from any public access. It permits you to use clips. That's a very important piece of the language of this law. It also permits you to digitize. And there are some specific examples of the feature film should already be digital in nature. You can only digitize a VHS copy, for example, if you can't already buy a digital version, blah, blah. This is a fairly complicated act, so this is obviously just a distillation. It also permits the digitization and display of still images in the same amount that would be used in a classroom. So if you have a faculty member who teaches art history and they want to digitize their slide carousel and show those in an online version of a course, that is perfectly legal. You're allowed to do that. The thing is that I say here institutions may choose to be Teach Act compliant or not. However, if you want to use the Teach Act, you must be Teach Act compliant. And there are a series of requirements that you have to meet, including having a secure network. You have to have a copyright education program in place. You have to have a person who is responsible for overseeing copyright, receiving cease and desist notice. There are a series of responsibilities. Mostly only large research universities have chosen to be Teach Act compliant. I don't know, honestly, if Bates publicly states that they are Teach Act compliant. I should probably find that out. But I know Penn State was, because I was on the Teach Act implementation committee, and we had to go through that checklist and make sure that Penn State complied with all of these requirements. The thing about, I say here, Teach Act can be used along with fair use. Neither is mutually exclusive, and that's because fair use talks about the copying piece of it, whereas Teach Act also has some discussion about copying, which you can take clips of. But also fair use does not talk about performance, whereas Teach Act does. So they are not, you're not going to want to just take one and forget the other if, in fact, you're at an institution that can be Teach Act compliant. One of the points I would like to make is that I mentioned that clips are what this act allows you to do. The language is actually reasonable and limited portions. There are some people who interpret that as meaning a reasonable and limited portion is the entire film. Well, maybe I won't show the credits. Well, that's even worse because those are the people who put the thing together. Again, this is a matter of risk assessment, and if you feel comfortable enough making full copies of films and making them available through your course management system, that's something that I would strongly encourage you to take up with your institutional attorney, just to make sure that you're not doing it without their support, because you don't want to be the person they go after if, in fact, you get found out that you're doing this, even though it's behind a firewall. Okay. Wow. Now it's time for your questions. So I'm going to talk to Chuck, who's asked, what about a teacher playing music for a dance that they got off of iTunes? That would, I think, first of all, the question I would have is, why would you do that? Because I don't know if the quality would be that good. You can always link to materials. That is a performance, and iTunes is pretty much designed as a personal kind of way to view something. I've seen iTunes and YouTube videos used in classrooms. I think that's a slightly different situation. And remember that in many cases, if you're doing a performance of a, if you're, and Chuck has just said to avoid paying for a DJ. And you know what? The thing is that most of our institutions have performance licenses with like BMI and ASCAP, and I would check to see if, in fact, that kind of performance might be covered under that license. But using it to avoid paying for a DJ, that's when you start to talk about things like, are you hampering the that's just the wrong reason to do it. I don't know how else to say it. You want to do it if, in fact, that's your only option, but to do it to avoid paying a DJ seems just kind of cheap to me. The whole answer is I'm not sure. But I think it would depend truly on your organization's contract with BMI and ASCAP, because that is how we license the ability to perform copyrighted music on our campuses. I'm assuming campus, Chuck. I don't know if that's true for you if you're at a school, but my guess is there must be something in place for the district, if in fact that's the case. Mindy asks, how are flipped classrooms impacted when teachers incorporate commercial video into their instruction and ask students to complete as a homework assignment, not necessarily in an educational enclosed setting? If they're doing that work on their own computer, that would be considered a distance education exemption. And when I said you can only use clips of materials, that is indeed the case. And what I would suggest, if in fact they want to show a whole work that they don't have public performance rights for, that they would put the material on reserve. Sometimes can't really control what we're allowed to do, and I know that that makes people very frustrated, but it is important that we model legal behavior for our students, and I know that's a difficult sell, particularly with teaching faculty. Believe me, I understand that. But trying to come up with a legal solution might be better. In some cases, if they're feature films, we've asked them to use Netflix and have the students get a Netflix account. Otherwise, you might be able to find one of the licensed streaming services that has the appropriate kind of material on it. If it's a YouTube video, you can always provide links to materials rather than embedding the video. So there are options. Often they're not the right ones, but there are ways that we can offer alternatives. Absolutely, Scott, please. That's why my email is here for you folks to get in touch if you would like to, and we can talk through things together. Again, I'm reading Mandy's question quickly, and I think, Mandy, what I may have to do is get in touch with you. If you're using things that are derivative of rubrics, learning targets, lesson plans, if you want to share them with colleagues, that's perfectly fine. You just want to make sure that you're not posting this kind of content on an open website. You want to be careful also if these are materials that are purchased or sold explicitly as educational materials. That kind of material, it's illegal to copy. So for those of you who have worksheets and things like that in workbooks and you just want to copy them and pass them out in class, that's actually, you want to check and see that might in fact be a copyright violation, because those materials tend to be licensed rather than sold outright. And I see we're down to about 2 minutes, and that's a good thing because I think I'm about to lose my voice. But so I'm actually going to stop this here, and I'm going to thank you all for participating. Got my email address, and I am more than happy to work with you on any issues. Again, I might not have the answer. My solution might be to talk to an institutional counsel if you've got one available, and if you don't, they should find somebody because these are very important issues. So thank you all very much. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you, Becky. And well, before I post this to our website, I better check with Becky since she's a copyright expert to make sure that it's okay that I do that. But I think she said that's okay. I do just want to add one thing. If there's more interest in learning more about copyright, we are actually planning on another copyright webinar in November, and this is going to be done by Lyrasis, and it's got a little bit different focus in that there are a lot of libraries that are applying for the state grant, state imaging grant, where they are seeking to digitize things like photographs and diaries and so forth that they have maybe in the repository. And we are going to have someone from Lyrasis talk about the copyright implications for a project like that. So we don't have a date yet confirmed, but it'll be in November. It'll be a webinar like this one. So if you're interested in learning more, just pay attention to e-news and the like to find out that the date and time of that. But that should be interesting as well. And Deborah, yes, there will be a recording of this presentation probably by the end of the week. And if you go to the Rails website, under Services, there is a Continuing Education Archives page, and that is where you'll be able to find it. So with that, Becky, again, thank you. I think this was very informative. And if you like Becky, you can see her again on the 22nd, where she's going to be talking about licensing of electronic content.